Great. Cool. All right. Well, I'm really happy to be here. I'm really glad I met Pile, I don't know, about 4 or 5 years ago now at the Bateson Cybernetics Conference at Asilomar. And then we re-met again at the Biosemiotics Conference most recently at Berkeley. And she invited me here, and I'm really pleased to re-give the talk. Hopefully I've improved it a little bit. It should only take like 20 or 30 minutes. I'd like to try and get through it and make the case. Of course, if there's something you just don't understand, please feel free to interrupt. But if you have larger questions or challenges, I'd really enjoy talking about those. I'd love to save a good amount of time for discussion, open discussion after the talk. And I've kind of already done it a little bit, but I want to set the stage a little bit with just a few disclaimers. When trying to ground anything anywhere, we tend to use available metaphors. I'm sort of a fan of George Lakoff, Metaphors We Live By, a really great book that just really highlights for really anyone. It's really fascinating to really realize a lot of the metaphors that we use just really in everyday life, and then we just use them habitually. And so I want to sort of do two main things with this talk. One is to, of course, ground semiosis in a physical medium. But while I'm doing that, I want to challenge the typical go-to metaphors, like the mechanical metaphors, the efficient causality, for example, which I'll talk about quite a bit more throughout the talk, in order to explain how biosemiotics arose out of non-semiotic systems, or how it's at all, as many have said, not absurd. That it should have happened. So this is, at a really coarse level, that this is a lot of times what we start with, kind of feedback loops. But I want to start by kind of challenging this conception, and asking kind of rhetorically, is this sequential understanding of, say, the self, for example, and its environment, is this dichotomy really how dynamic systems are? What I suggest is the answer is no, and this talk will try and make that case, and offers an alternative conception. For example, one of the problems with this conception is that, the self, if we're to say an animal, for example, is considered a self, and then its environment is its surroundings. The dynamic variables, the variables in each of those separate, subsystems, to use that vocabulary for now, are they really separable variables? When you have your systems of equations, in grand old, general system theory, I was a huge fan of Bertalanffy for a while. And when you're looking at those system equations, are the variables separable enough to really, such that this view, this sequential dichotomous view, is it really helpful for us? It's really interesting. I love this, this little equation down here from Lewin. Behavior is a function of the self plus the environment. I think that's the right intuition. I mean, behavior really does entail both of those entities, but then the crux of the question that remains unanswered is how those things interact and, in a sense, realize each other. So to ground biosemiotics in the physics, I'll break this talk into three necessary and I'll endeavor to make the case sufficient attributes of self-sustaining Umwelts embedded in their surroundings. And the term Umwelt, can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. I think that the talk as a whole will make a bit more rigorous what I'm intending by the term Umwelt. But in quick summary, and again, I'll have 3 sections that'll go through like about 7 minutes each that'll dig into these topics. So please don't feel like if you don't understand what what I'm saying at the moment. Don't worry about it. But so paradox resilience, I think life fundamentally from the get-go, from out of the primordial soup, so to speak, that's its first job. It has to be able to navigate paradox. It has to be able to withstand kind of a both and ambiguous reality. And again, I'll get into that more. But really, indeterminacy. How does it deal with indeterminacy? And how it actually leverages that resiliently. Then the second section will be about spanning the ontological gap. This gets into I'll leverage Jeremy England's work and Terrance Deacon's work in order to talk about how it is life does a really amazing thing where, well, it spans the ontological gap, and I'll explain what that is in that section. And then the final sort of resolution, if you will, the conclusion will be to those first two sections will sort of present and elucidate the question and really sort of round out and I think hopefully better define really what the question is in front of us in grounding biosemiotics. And then propose in the third section, this what I call the high dimensional superpose milieu, which is a bit of a mouthful, but yeah, hopefully by the end it'll make some sense. So I'll start with, this first section is a bit more conceptual, and it's really getting a feel, almost like a sort of an Eastern philosophy feel for this kind of both and reality. And I love this. Most of you probably heard the story of the blind man and the elephant, but just to review it really quickly, basically it's the idea that, you have one blind man who comes up to the tail and says, but the elephant is a rope, and then the other grabs the leg and says, no, the elephant is a tree trunk, and then the other grabs its trunk and says, no, the elephant is a snake, and they both go around, they all go around disagreeing vehemently about the nature of an elephant. But in a sense, the elephant is understood via sign relations. I mean, each blind monk has some kind of semiotics in order to do the work to be able to interpret, one element of the elephant. But then there's this higher order work in theory in order to resolve the dilemma between the arguing blind men. That there's this higher order work that each monk has to transduce and translate their own experience with their neighbor's experience in order to do kind of this meta work, if you will, this higher order biosemiotic work. And it's really, it's one of the notions of the crux before us is how it is life scales, how it scales, say, one interpretation, one aspect of its environment and integrates it, synthesizes it with another aspect. And this is a fundamental trick, so to speak, navigating the so-called, as I mentioned before, the ambiguity between each interpretation, how it is that higher order meta work can scale in order to adapt, in essence. So again, just to sort of press the point, from a slightly different perspective, from like design theory, for example, and psychology, Gestalt ambiguity is intrinsic to this scaling. I'll argue that, sort of seeing things both ways, if you will, being able to see the elephant from at least, two different aspects is certainly requires more work and more complex work, but it also has certain rewards. Ambiguity in the Umwelt is both a risk and a reward. But the thing is that it's not just a nice to have to be able to say, oh, okay, life navigates ambiguity. What I'll argue is that this is reality all the way down. Existential decisions will always be made with incomplete information. That's really kind of the hallmark of, the crux of artificial intelligence right now is dealing with that ambiguity and these sort of higher order generalizations that we humans and even animals take for granted in navigating and intrinsically in a world that has way more information than any one living being can take in even within a lifetime. Nevertheless, you've got to try. You adapt or perish. So in essence, that's the first section basically. And I just wanted to introduce kind of this both and logic and the importance of ambiguity, and how indeterminacy is really a fundamental aspect of any semiotic endeavor. All right, so this is probably the more technical aspect of the talk. And grab a drink of water really quickly.
Do you prefer questions at the end, or do you entertain interruptions?
If it's a clarification, but maybe it's more of a discussion promoting question, maybe that could wait till the end. I'll leave that to your discretion. Okay, let's see, introduce, so the ontological gap, well, it's probably best just to talk about I'll talk about Jeremy England. So Jeremy England did some interesting work. He was sort of the golden child, if you will, a couple years back, if you haven't heard of his work, in far from equilibrium models that basically systems that tune to an external driver, so that you have a system that will, when exposed or perturbed to a perturbation or a signal in the environment, it'll reorganize its internal organization in order to and essentially develop, self-organize a sympathy, if you will, or tuning. He talks about tuning quite a bit to that external driver. And I think, well, anyway, we'll get into the music analogies later. But with that external driver, chemical networks can arrange themselves to resonate, a kind of proto-semiosis. Loosely speaking, or maybe not so loosely, for the Persians in the audience, this could be think of as iconicity in a semiotic sense, like just I don't want to use the word functional, that's sort of a dangerous word, but a likeness type fit. It's not, and then on top of that, the network could be kind of indexical, if you will. But we'll say a little bit more about that later. I like to use the swing analogy just to get a feel for the idea of the driver, in this case, in Jeremy England's work, the environment, and the resonant chemical reaction, the systems that he's dealing with as the child. If you remove the external driver, in this analogy, the mom, the chemical reaction dissipates. The child will stop swinging. But it's important to point out, like, even though I use this analogy, that there's no self in self-organization, and we can talk about this further, because there is no habit. You remove the external driver, in essence, the environment forgets this dynamic. And so the question becomes, well, how does the environment remember self-organization? If, for example, to put this in other terms, like if you have a whirlpool and in a stream, and the stream stops flowing, then the whirlpool ceases to exist. That self-organization, so to speak, ceases to exist. The driver, being the river, is required. That external driver is required to create the whirlpool. And in essence, the environment, once the driver, the stream, stops flowing and the whirlpool dissipates, then the environment, in essence, forgets, in quotes, forgets that order ever existed. So what's interesting about biosemiotic systems is that somehow those self-organizations are remembered. They create a habit, and so selves create habits. But what kind of habits? So habits that can weather ambiguity and indeterminacy in the environment while taking advantage of what it offers is is going back to sort of that abiogenetic, and this is Terrance Deacon's work about the autogen, and the idea is that if you could conceive, which Deacon has proposed, a system, a chemical system that in essence tries to capture that habit, so to speak. So even in this thermodynamic diagram, let's see, I think, oh, sorry, everybody. So can you guys see, can you see my cursor? Yeah, cool. So I'll get into this is Deacon's famous for his slides. I'll get into this one in a second, but let me talk about the chemistry really quickly from like a classic standpoint. Basically, as the free energy dissipates, is used by the system, what typically happens is systems will move towards equilibrium, and then when they reach full dissipation down here at the bottom, the system, this is sort of like forgetting, if you will, any order that might have been up at the top is, in terms of the chemical reactions, like imagine an autocatalytic set that might be happening once the reactants, the energy giving molecules dissipate, say in a BZ reaction, for example, then when you get down to the bottom, it's as if that pattern never existed. So what Deacon proposes is that you have a very particular kind of autocatalytic reactions, and the logic is that as you move towards equilibrium, some of the byproducts of this chemical reaction, of this autocatalytic set, will create a shell, and that shell will capture some of the reactants and localize them so that they don't completely dissipate, at least spatially. The idea being is that what he calls like the starter kit, that sort of starter kit is caught, so that in the future, and then over in this diagram, if you could imagine sort of a cycle of annealing and then breaking open in an environment that, say, for example, has more reactants. And then as the reactants dissipate or consumed, then it forms more shells, and then it can float from an environment that's been depleted of reactants to another environment that has, again, more reactants, more chemical reactions induce the shell to break open again, and then creates more shells, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what we like to call spanning the ontological gap, because the idea is that, and this is really powerful, if anything like this, well, of course, something like this had to have happened in some way, in the sense that life had to figure out that how to span the gap between the indeterminacies in the environment. Like, how does the living system, the biosemiotic, system at the origin of life, embody habit that spans the gap of that external driver, so that when the external driver dissipates, it doesn't completely negate the chance that that dynamic won't be recreated, in essence, air quotes, remembered. And this is kind of Deacon's core, I think, core insight, and in spanning the so-called ontological gap, and being able to kind of have any notion of homeostasis in the face of indeterminacy and much wider fluctuations in the surroundings. So I think I'll pause right there. Is there any, because sometimes that those two technical works might be a little confusing, or I just didn't explain it very well. Are there any questions about these studies? Okay, let's see. So yeah, to to do, let me just check my notes to make sure that I didn't skip anything really critical. Oh yeah, so what I also want to say is that I'm talking about, I think another thing that Deacon gets right here is that there's this logic where you have, how to put this, like these kind of complementary attributes, where to do this kind of spanning of the ontological gap, you have two distinct tendencies that constrain each other. So Deacon talks a lot about constraint, which I think is a beneficial, a really helpful concept to work with. So that one aspect of this dynamic is chemically active and distributed, like in the case here. And as you're in this sort of descent, utilizing your available free energy, so that it can intermix with others and the environment and create more dynamics. And then you have this other aspect that's chemically inert and localized. Again, I said most of this, but just to make sure that this sort of logic, this complementary logic, this sort of inert localized logic then is more about preserving the capacity and, like I said, the likelihood of restarting similar dynamics in more hospitable environments. Yeah, span the gap. Okay, so how are these two studies the basis for Umwelt and semiosis? All right, what I want to do now is basically leverage both, because I think each study, each body of work, Jeremy's and England's and Deacon's, I think they kind of need each other a bit. And I don't think Terry would deny that. I'm not sure about England, but I think that they both complement each other quite well. So for example, Deacon doesn't talk a lot. He talks a little bit in his more extended, what he calls the sensitive shell autogen, which I helped him develop, and we published a paper together about it. Talk about kind of the more iconistic in a Peircean sense, like iconicity, like that might be there's a ligand or some sort of chemical element on the shell that's literally tuned, so to speak, using that term very loosely, sort of in a lock and key way, that when a certain reactants in the environment, or some kind of indicator, if you will, of the availability of reactants, it'll connect to this shell molecule and then destabilize the shell and break it open. So that, then you're really getting into, I think, really interesting semiosis at that point. And Deacon is really excited about that as well. But having said that, I think I wanted to make my larger case. I really think England's work is really powerful in the idea that it really leverages the autocatalytic sets as a means to create tunings. Again, Jeremy's own language, so that the chemical systems are, in essence, as they're driven in their sort of in that driven phase, with where you have the available free energy, that the system will essentially tune itself, the chemical system, and then that coupled with Deacon's work, where it gets captured, so that as the driver dissipates, you're capturing a bunch of England's networks, chemical networks. So you can begin to imagine how this might scale. So in this case, what I'm sort of leveraging is like, okay, well, how can each blind man with his own perspective on the elephant have his own sort of coupling between the England's tuning chemical systems and Deacon's autogen, and they each have their own sets of chemicals, and so that you have the externally coupled, each is externally coupled in their own way to sort of perceive, if you will, the elephant, perceive their environment in their own way. and they also simultaneously have the internal habit to retain that coupling. Of course, I'm sort of alluding to this scaling, and I really haven't answered how that's possible, because you're still stuck with each blind man with his own perspective. They've captured their own autocatalytic sets that may or may not be tuned to some aspect of the environment. That's all fine and good, but we still haven't done, in my view, the heavy lifting of real synthesis and integration. And why this matters, and why I'm going to tell it, this quick story about Appleness, is basically in response to the AI community that would argue it just doesn't matter. I mean, you just have each blind man with their own perspective, and you just put them in a list and in a data structure, and maybe you have some sort of indices one point into the other, and then that's elephantness. Well, what I want to suggest is that's not enough. So for example, Appleness is like, you could have an infinite number of attributes of an apple: its roundness, its redness, its crunchiness, its weight, its redness. I don't know if I said that, but all those independent attributes are not nearly as effective as just a handful, a finite number of attributes and their interrelations simultaneously. And the term, I don't say the word simultaneously lightly, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. So how do Umwelts embody elephantness and appleness? How do each of these systems come together, each of these separate dynamics come together to create a truly unified and useful and adaptive higher order dynamic to create work pathways of work pathways, if you will. All right. So this is the final section, and it's sort of the punchline, if you will. Like I said before, like the previous two sections were, I hope, setting the question, and maybe providing some useful research to ground some of the physics, which I'll now leverage into the synthesis, and hopefully convincingly propose a possible answer to the dilemma. And of course, as you know, I've called this the high dimensional superpose milieu, which I'll describe shortly. And my own work, this image is just a quick look at, it's not just about chemical systems, although that's certainly where I think it started. But this is an image from my own work. I use coupled electronic oscillators in order to do this work of having, so that each oscillator would have its own tuning, and this gets to the music, how I was largely inspired or helped along by my digging into music. But what's really sort of central to both this effort and what I'll talk about in the chemical system in the next slide is that the superpose milieu, or what I called in the past the interstitial medium or common medium, that there needs to be a common medium. And well, of course there's a common medium. There's always been a common medium ever since the beginning of life. Chemical systems are embedded in chemical systems, like they are their own culture. And so in this example, in order to try and do it empirically in my own work, I'm using, as I said, electronic oscillators that are so-called, talking to each other, not just through pre-wired wires, but through the interstitial medium of whether it's air, if you're talking about, say, musical instruments or tuning forks, or the electromagnetic field. And there's lots of studies out there about, and we could talk about if you guys are interested. I've researched quite a bit about, Christoph Koch and other folks showing how, aphatic coupling between neurons, that they too are using, that they're fundamentally of their interstitial milieu, their chemical context. And that's a fundamental that nature didn't evolve to try and insulate itself from this ambiguity and milieu, that it actually leverages it. And that's a good segue into this. So basically what I've done here is taken two of Terry's different, so he has the autogen, what he calls a spherical autogen, and this is more analogous to the say for example, a microtubule that would self-assemble and then break apart on some sort of cycle. Now, if we imagine that the cytoplasm has a whole host of these different catalytic sets that create different kinds of shells at different rates, that dissipate and re-anneal at different rates, then we can also imagine that in their interstitial milieu, in their common medium, chemical medium, they have the opportunity to overlap. And this overlapping, that the careful balance between, as I was saying before, the logic, if you will, of the more localized, slowing down, like self-regulating one's own reaction by creating shells, and the more sort of promiscuous, if you will, allowing the diffusion and the reactions to occur, that those two tendencies would be tuned, if you will, and balanced based on the nature of the chemistry, and its interaction with other chemical sets, and that they would have so these are Jeremy England's diagrams, and what I did is I basically superposed them and said, okay, well, you have these chemical agents, and these other different chemical agents creating their own tuning, and these would be like, say, the byproducts of reaction and their proportions. But we could imagine how they'd superpose in this milieu, and that to create the opportunity for higher order work pathways, higher order being essentially more complex work pathways. The idea being that this could then recognize more complex patterns in the environment and even do more complex kinds of work and behaviors. So, for example, and so this is second to last slide. This is a really neat study. I really enjoy. So this guy, Nagagaki, he's of slime mold fame. Some of you might have heard of that study, and I think 2000 that he did about a slime mold solving a maze. And this isn't that study, but it's the same guy with different folks. And this is really, I think, almost more interesting and powerful, because he with his team showed that both empirically, and then, so this is the empirical data over here, and then this here is a model that they came up with, a model, just a series of equations in order to better understand, see if, what kind of dynamics, at least mathematically speaking, they could come up with that would mimic this, simulate this. And it's really fascinating. So basically what they did is, going over to the empirical data, this is temperature, and can you guys see my cursor still? Okay. This is temperature, this is humidity, and then what they did is they essentially, at this regular interval of S1, S2, S3, they made it really cold for the amoeba and less humid, so both of these are bad for the amoeba. This is shocking the amoeba. And they did this on a regular cycle. And then what they saw is that after doing this on a regular cycle 3 times, this down here is the speed of the amoeba, and this is actually acceleration, or the difference in speed from one chunk, from one time block to the next. But so note that it does react sort of with a little lag to each of these shocks. And what's interesting is that these 3 arrows, what they're showing is that the amoeba is actually slowing down without the external stimulation. I want to let that sink in for a second. So basically a single cell organism with no nervous system generated an internal habit. And then over here at S4, so they let that dissipate, that reaction dissipate. So C4 and C5, it's not doing, it's going back to its usual sort of oscillatory starting and stopping, as if it had never been trained. And then they shock it again at S4, and then at S6, like ringing a bell, again, C6 and a little bit at C7, it again slowed down without the external stimulation. So the habit had sort of persisted. And this, in essence, is the ontological gap, or maybe in this case, we could say epistemological gap. In other words, the habit has persisted, the knowledge, so to speak, it's internalized a habit that is relevant to both its environment and its own adaptive behavior simultaneously. And so and I want to read a quick quote, sort of a picking from their paper. It's not super long, but I think it really elucidates some really fascinating notions, and captures what they think is going on, which they're graphically showing here in these diagrams, which are non-trivial to explain, but we can get into those a little bit if you're interested in. So the quote is from the 2008 Amoeba paper. Quote, we assume that multiple chemical oscillators of a series of periods underline the multirhythmicity of locomotion, as multiple rhythms were observed in cellular activities in a plasmodium. The total activity of locomotion over an entire organism depends on the sum of oscillations. The existence of the spontaneous in-phase slowdown, so that these are the spontaneous in-phase slowdowns, meaning the ones without external stimulation. The existence of the spontaneous in-phase slowdown response means that the organism anticipates the next periodic environmental change. To perform this function, it needs the ability to memorize the periodicity. So this just like, oh, I got really excited when I found this paper. And I think it typifies a really great example of an Umwelt, of biosemiotics, and in a way where we're getting down to the scale, we're not confused by, we're not distracted by neurons or really complex biological behaviors. We're seeing some really pretty sophisticated behaviors, if you want to look at it computationally, really powerful in a single cell. So I could dig deeper into, how this study relates to this. It's speculation, but I'll save that for the discussion depending on which way that goes. So to conclude, I think we're faced with, like I said at the beginning, I want to move the conversation, or at least add to the conversation, not necessarily, certainly taking any, I don't want to necessarily take anything away from traditional cybernetic systems theories, but I definitely want to add something. So going back to the classics, we're sort of going back to, say, Heraclitus, for example, we're left with a bit of a paradox, because it's interesting that in order to maintain its own dynamic, in order to maintain a homeostasis, the amoeba or any living system has to change, has to adapt. And so it's kind of, if you will, changing to remain the same, changing to remain in the, moving to stay in the same spot, sort of that Heraclitean, never step in the same river twice kind of thing. So it's not only by stepwise efficient causality, and this is bringing in a little Aristotle, but also by superposed formal causality. So again, leveraging the classics for whatever they're worth, Aristotle talked about four causes. I think in this day and age, we operate habitually off mainly material causality and efficient causality, sort of the, efficient causality being that sort of a cause always precedes an effect sequentially. Formal causality is different. Aristotle identified formal causality sort of as the heart of design, and I suppose that's why I'm here advocating this, is because Aristotle himself sort of thought of formal causality as like design. It's sort of the idea of the material causality would be the wood going into the table. Efficient causality is the hammer coming down on the chisel to chisel that material. Formal causality is the design. Final causality is his fourth cause would be, having dinner. So it's really interesting to think of it semiotically, even the relationship. Like I think you could be, it's a really interesting mapping of Peirce's triads to these different kinds of causality. But anyway, that's a different that's another conversation. But again, to summarize, the complex dynamics that are about the environment, they're about the environment and the self simultaneously. Like each of these is what this very rough sketch is trying to kind of move. It's meant to be in contrast to this. Although there's nothing really dynamic about this sketch, of course, it's two-dimensional, and I think we're always struggling with the two-dimensional medium we work with regularly. There's no third dimension, there's no time-based dimension in a lot of the ways that we communicate. Most of the ways, I mean, we have video and all that stuff, but I think you guys get my point. But the main point I want to make is these gradients here, is that there's these successive gradients of the self to its environment. And I think a really key point is this idea of scaling, that at every scale, there's another milieu. So there's the milieu, if you will, at the autogen level, there's the milieu at the cellular level, and each of these are embedded within each other. So it really challenges the idea that subsumptive architectures, if you will, like the hierarchies, like the great chain of being, that the atom, there's atoms in the molecules in the cells, and then cells in the body, and that well, is it bottom up or is it top down? I think we get caught in these stories that we've inherited as if it has to be one or the other. And what I want to sort of end on is that it's not one or the other. It's necessarily both and superposed simultaneously.